would anybody do Trank Dope? Remember the stuff in Philadelphia? Animal tranquilizer, xylazine, pieces of skin and body parts falling off, people being called zombies, a true local epidemic that was devastating. My videos at that time explaining Trank Dope did quite well. They were very highly viewed on the internet. I'm going to do a general review on this topic shortly in the next couple of weeks, but I'm going to ask that question today that I think is really important in that it gives you insight into potential possibilities for treatment in the future, changing our paradigm and our perspective of substance abuse treatment, what it should be, and how we can save lives. Let's get started. Dr. B 360, welcome to my podcast. Look, Trank Dope, if everyone remembers, it's xylazine, an animal veterinary tranquilizer. It was mixed into the fentanyl supply in Philadelphia initially. And, I did some videos on that did really well and educated a lot of people. And that has all evolved. And in the next few weeks, I'll make some videos on that evolution, because now we also have additional synthetic that are also being spread, and that needs to be discussed. But for now, I want to ask, why are people doing Trank Dope if it's corrosive to the mind, corrosive to the body, and so much more debilitating than fentanyl? Well, the first answer, and part of the answer, again, depends how you look at it, is the fact that, market forces dictate how drug dealers, cartels, those people that put this stuff out, make their decisions. Market forces in the sense that it's purely a profit-driven thing, correct? And that's not hard to understand, right? I don't think when you start getting in the drug game, you're necessarily taking business or professional ethics courses, or do you care? It's just what increases profits. Fine, that's that part of the equation. And maybe you can't find any pure fentanyl anyways out there, and maybe more so in the future. But there's another way where these things are driven. And I want to argue that Trank Dope, or the concept of Trank Dope, mixing something in with the fentanyl for a different reason, additional reason, a synergistic reason, besides market forces, okay? I'm going to argue this has been going back to the 70s. And currently, we can say this about Trank Dope, and I'm going to give you an example of why I believe my argument is right. Recently, I've been making the videos about Euphoria and the need to consider the euphoric index, doing studies, bringing it into the discussion and the conversation for medication-assisted treatment, because that gap in euphoria is what is driving the fentanyl overdoses, even though it's polysubstance, but it's really the fentanyl that causes the overdose, and our difficulty on transitioning people into medication-assisted treatment. That conversation is there in a couple of videos before this. There's a long video that I talk about this, and I bring up the issue of methadone and why it's more important than ever. Shorter videos, I talk about the value of pharmaceutical-grade heroin. And so I've discussed the importance of considering euphoria in the treatment of addiction and the general social, political, cultural stigma around that concept of euphoria. I even did a video giving a little historical background of the term and how it was pathologized and incorporated into the medical vernacular in a negative way. And I argue that adding the tranquilizer, the xylazine, in fentanyl actually gives the intention, the purpose, the value at some 30,000 foot level is to get that high, that euphoria that fentanyl doesn't give. I've discussed it in other videos. I even put some sort of an order on it. And I discussed extensively why heroin is a much better high than fentanyl, although fentanyl is a lot more potent than heroin, much more abuse potential, much more addicting, in many ways, a lot more miserable. And it goes from 0 to 60 really fast, 60 being the nod off zone. And that Goldilocks euphoria zone is much shorter and not as robust, but it's more potent anyway. And so you get into this vicious cyclical trap. I propose, as fentanyl is what is much easier, cheaper, cost efficient, and effective to produce and put out there and creates more addicts. And obviously, if I was the producer of this stuff, you don't want everyone to die off, right? And that has to be some degree of consideration if you're putting this stuff out. You don't want all your customers to die off. But I think adding that xylazine, that animal tranquilizer, is with the hope, with the idea that it gives it that edge, that euphoria that the addict is looking for when using fentanyl, which is, for the most part, a crappy high compared to something like heroin. Does that sound crazy? Okay. I've already described some of these issues in my previous video, including why it's difficult to get on methadone. But let's take this back. Let's take it back to the 70s. In the 70s, methadone clinics started popping up, regulated methadone maintenance treatments, and so forth and so on. And one of the things you saw when benzodiazepines, in particular Valium, came out in the 70s and then in the 80s is, addicts are extremely brilliant kitchen chemists. And what you started to see is they started to abuse Valium along with their methadone to give it that extra edge, that extra euphoria, and what I call euphoric index. See, methadone is also not that great of a high. One of my friends has argued that it might be a little bit better than long-acting heroin, and there's nuances to discuss here, but nevertheless, compared to heroin, it's a flat drug, right? It takes care of your cravings and withdrawals and has some consequences, but it's not that great of a high. So naturally, when you have somebody getting on methadone maintenance and all of a sudden they figure out that they can add a little bit of Valium to that, right? Especially guys coming off of pure heroin, maybe much more so in the 70s than nowadays, because you can't even find good China white heroin, and you're lucky if you can find Mexican heroin in pure form. Nevertheless, it was even more difficult for these guys in the 70s going from heroin to something as flat as methadone, and they started mixing in the Valium and abusing that with it. There is evidence for the need for that euphoria to be able to maintain somebody on maintenance treatment, and why it needs to be considered in our treatment algorithm, clinical discussions, and research. Then you go from the 70s and you come up to the early 2000s. What were addicts and methadone clinics doing in the US? Well, that's around the time where the Mexicans started to really industrialize Mexican heroin and its distribution in the United States for dirt cheap. And an addict would go into the methadone clinic, do their methadone for the day, and then pick up for a bag for $20 from the Mexicans in the cars and add that to their methadone. Okay? Why? Right? People aren't just trying to do as much drugs as possible. That's not how it works, actually, right? They were again aiming and trying to achieve that Goldilocks euphoric zone with that extra dose of heroin, Mexican heroin. Well, nowadays, it's just pure fentanyl. And let me correct the way I said that. It's just fentanyl, that's garbage, right? And it's very highly cut up, but very highly addicting, short acting, and so forth. Other videos have explained that. In that context, it makes total, complete sense why adding a tranquilizer, an animal tranquilizer, to your dope is something that is going to catch on. The addict is still, even one that's using drugs on the street and is highly addicted to it for deep ingrained physiological reasons, is still searching for that euphoria. Okay, I'm not going to call it high, and there's going to be another place, another time where I sort of begin to dig in and explain what I mean more so about the euphoria than I have before. But that Trank Dope makes sense in the context of the need for euphoria when an addict is using opiates or really any other drug where the euphoria actually changes a little bit, but nevertheless, it's an important component in addiction. Look, the point is this: if we are going to look at all of this as a public health issue, approach it with public health measures, clinical, medical measures, we need to be honest, and we need to not let our biases, politics, emotions, bizarre values we may have to take any kind of role in treating a human being in need, right? And that being said, the Trank Dope is another piece of evidence why it's important to consider euphoria and create a euphoric index and start clinical discussions about the role of euphoria, both at the individual level, at the clinical literature level, public health level, and policy level. Trank Dope is just another attempt for the addict to reach that critical and important euphoric Goldilocks zone that I've discussed in the last few videos that is just not there, and it's never been there. And we see it all the way back to the 70s when they started to add Valium to methadone. And methadone, although I'm a big fan and an advocate, and even more so nowadays in the age of fentanyl without euphoria, because methadone is better than Suboxone, it was still being added back then because they were transitioning from heroin to methadone. I hope you enjoyed this piece. Please leave your thoughts and comments below. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Subscriptions are a free, cheap, and easy way to help the channel grow, and I can make better and more videos for you. See you guys soon. Peace.